I was asked to come speak at People Around the World here at the U of S, and I was excited to do it for a couple of reasons. I've spoken to the U of S in the past about becoming more globally engaged, so the fact that they were doing it was like a booyah moment, which was fantastic. I think, and I say this to minority communities as well, I come from the Muslim minority community here in Saskatoon, and I've always said, as a minority community, oftentimes when we are feeling attacked or when we're feeling diminished, we tend to say, like, where are our allies? Everybody stand up for us. And unfortunately, at times, that our same minority communities don't do that for each other, right? We don't stand up for the First Nations community. We're getting much better at it now, in general in Saskatoon, but historically, communities have always been little pockets, and academia is in and of itself its own community. And I think it's remarkable for academia to start saying, listen, we have challenges in Saskatoon, we have challenges in Saskatchewan and in Canada. They are inherent, they are historic, they are debilitating in many ways to our long-term sustainable peace, prosperity, etc. And we have to do something about it. And we're going to take the opportunity to actually invite that conversation into the halls. I think that's a remarkable thing to do. And I think academia around the world is beginning to understand that they are part and parcel of this conversation, at times the cause of some of the challenges, some of the language, some of the rhetoric, some of the, but that if they don't really pick that up, then you can't expect that reciprocation in the community. So I'm very excited to be here. I think it's an opportunity for us to actually look and say, you know what, in Saskatoon we've had challenges historically with multiculturalism, we've had challenges with racism, we've had challenges with the negation of women's rights, particularly First Nations women. What are we going to do about it? How can we do better? And in a university that's well known for studies on food and water security and agriculture, okay, how are we going to impact the rest of the world? How are we going to bring our expertise to the table? But how are we also going to listen to local communities so we're not robbing them of their own Indigenous belief system or their expertise or their knowledge about their own, earth or their own community. So I'm excited to be here. I think in order to ensure access for girls' education and to really ensure that education itself is an equalizer around the world, we have to first start talking about who we're giving that responsibility to and who gets the accountability and ownership of that conversation. When we talk about education across the board, we tend to talk about the quantity, not necessarily the quality, and we tend to look at it as numbers, right? So, we've educated 2,000 children today without really looking at what that translates to empirically on the ground and how that translates practically for families. So if we truly wanted education to be an equalizer, we'd have to first and foremost invest a lot more in young girls and be very deliberate about it. It can't just be we're going to check off 2,000 kids and say, okay, we'll pat ourselves on the back, but rather, how are we putting this money into this community? Who is getting the money? Because oftentimes when we do dedicate something to girls' education or women's rights, it isn't actually spent on that in the community. So how do we ensure that that's actually translated on the ground? And how do we build the infrastructure? I mean, if it's a volatile community, how do we build safe schools? How do we build environments where these girls feel welcome? And then how do we continue that onwards? It doesn't make sense to just go to school for 2 years and then stop because there's no opportunity. But how do we create an ecosystem where if she is the only person who is able to provide in her family, we have 12, 10, 9-year-old girls selling tea because nobody else in their family can provide. How do we ensure that their family has provision so the girl can go to school in that short term? It's really about creating an ecosystem. First and foremost, we have to speak to local communities and ask them what the challenges are, right? So if you're going into a community that is strife with conflict, where socially they're very pro-girls' education, but the reality of the situation is they don't want to send their girls to dangerous schools, that's going to be a very different conversation than a community where they fundamentally don't believe girls should be educated. It's going to be a very different conversation than if you go into a community where they send their girls to school, but once they get their period, the girls start staying home, right? So local context is fundamentally important, and the only people who can really direct us in that are local leaders, are local teachers, local moms, local parents, local representatives, local doctors, nurses, etc. And we really need their leadership there. From there, you can then start saying, okay, so if the challenge is sanitation, who can we work with on sanitation in this region? Who can we work with? Maybe we can get corporations who are interested. Maybe we can get greater political will and political interest. Maybe we can even get the local community to fundraise, and maybe we can have local organizations talk about social taboos. But it really becomes about looking at all of the different stakeholders and how you can really almost leverage each one with the support and leadership and really guidance of that local community. I think the single greatest challenge we have today is probably the way in which we talk to each other. I think that would be my biggest, I've worked in a lot of conflict countries. I've worked with a lot of people impacted and affected by conflict. I do that every day. And I think one of the great disappointments is the lack of empathy and compassion we have for another. And the fact that we look at leadership almost as though it's just kind of succumbing to the lowest common denominator, or it's brute force, and it's angry leadership, and it's reactionary. And I think that's devastating when it comes to global peace, because you cannot build peace on, emotional, reactionary, angry rhetoric. You just can't. People don't feel safe. People don't feel like they can negotiate in that space. They can compromise in that space. They can listen in that space. And so I think truly the greatest obstacle to global peace and security is the way in which we treat one another, and the way in which we listen to one another, and who we deem is worthy of being listened to. And a huge part of that, I think, is how we define leadership, and the fact that traditionally we have not viewed feminine characteristics of leadership as positive. We view masculine characteristics. And I think as much for women as it is for men, we need to redefine that. We need to take apart that conversation and talk to our sons about what the world is telling them, a real man looks like, and talk to our daughters about what the world is telling them a real woman looks like.